Hi, I'm Darren Morton and welcome to Happiness by Design. In this episode we pose the question, why bother being happy? I once heard someone muse, they made the comment, well, what's the use of happiness? It can't buy you money. Well, that might be the case, but the truth is that happiness and indeed the ability to be able to go after and achieve positive emotions has a lot of use. And in this series we're going to explore what it is, why that is the case. Over the course of this series we've been introduced to Fred the half-head, and I want to just open up Fred's head one more time just to recap on some of the things that we've discussed. Essentially, we've learnt that this part of our brain, and all our brains look much the same inside, this part of the brain known as the limbic system is responsible for our emotional state. It's the part of our brain that decides when we feel happy or vibrant as well as down and depressed. And what we've discovered is this part of your brain is not only your emotional hub, it's also responsible for your motivation, for the things you go after in your life, for your memories, which is interesting, and that's a key aspect of our cognition. And then last of all, it's involved in many automatic or autonomic bodily processes, including heart rate, gut function, and even our immune system. And so what we've developed is this concept that this part of the brain is integral to who we are and what we become. It's integral certainly to our level of happiness. And throughout the series we've looked at how this part of your brain is wired, how it's configured. And we've learnt that the limbic system receives messages from places like the front portion of the higher brain. This is the part of our brain responsible for attention, what we focus on, what we give our thoughts and what we look towards. And hence that is why our focus influences our feelings. We also learnt that this part of some other parts over here of the higher brain, which are involved in speech and language, have a powerful effect once again upon the limbic system. And hence our language and how we communicate, how we talk to ourselves, not just audibly but also in our head, our internal dialogue, how we explain life circumstances to ourselves. All of these have an impact on our emotional state. We learnt that there are literally millions of little nerve endings distributed throughout your body that feed information back to your brain. And on their way from these outer realms of your body, they tell the limbic system how you're moving. And accordingly, motion, your posture, your physical activity levels influence your emotional state. And then finally, your senses, your sights, your sounds and your smells that you encounter, the environment that you're immersed in, can have a huge impact once again on your emotional state. And hence the importance of spending time in the natural environment. That's what we were created for. And ensuring that our social dynamic, our social environment is also very positive. So what I've been trying to do is to develop in you the notion that we can actually use these sources of input to our emotional brain to change our emotional state. And that's such an important thing to do, because I want to make a statement and I want you to think deeply about this and test it. The statement says, the quality of your life is determined by the quality of your emotions. I'll say it one more time. The quality of your life is determined by the quality of your emotions. Now, if you're not quite convinced that that's the case, let me illustrate for you. Let's take two individuals. First of all, we have on this corner here, we have Betty. Not to pick on any Bettys, I hope, but Betty, she spends 60% of her time happy. And she spends another 20% of her time excited and overjoyed. And then she spends the final 20% of her time consumed with these feelings of infatuation and puppy love. You might remember those days from a distant past. Now, what would we say about the quality of Betty's life? She's either happy, she's excited, or she's got these bubbly feelings inside. You know, I think that everyone would agree that the quality of Betty's life is very high. If we were to contrast Betty with Frankie, sorry Frankie if there's any Frankies out there viewing, but Frankie spends 60% of his time stressed out. And then the other 20% of the time he is angry and frustrated. And then the other 20%, the remaining 20% of the time, he is just depressed and feeling down. Now, I doubt that there's anyone that is putting up their hand saying, yes, I want to be just like Frankie, because the quality of Frankie's life is very, very poor. You see, I'll say it again, the quality of your life is determined by the quality of your emotions. And you might ask, so where does the type of car that I have, or the house I own, or the career that I have, how does that come to play here? How does that have its effect on the quality of our life? Well, what those things do, these things that we try and consume in the pursuit of achieving a high quality of life, in fact, all they do is create within us a feeling. And if that emotion, if that feeling it creates is a positive one, well then it's true, they do contribute to our quality of life. But if the feelings they bring are negative ones, then they actually detract from our quality of life. Let's take riches, for example. Now, I know of some people that have an enormous amount of resources in terms of wealth. Yet for some of them, what happens is that source of wealth becomes a source of really anxiety, of negative emotions for them, because they're stressed about it. They're stressed about how they can grow this more and how people might be trying to do them out of it. And so what they don't realise is that thing that we sort of think is, oh yes, if we had lots of money, then we would have a positive quality of life. What happens is that becomes the source of negative emotions for them. And in so doing, it actually becomes or detracts from their quality of life. I do, as I said, I know quite a few people with quite a bit of money, and I'm not one of them, I should point out here. But sometimes, because of people's immense resources, it means that they can actually spend more time in nurturing relationships. They can make greater contributions. They can make a bigger difference with the resources that they have. And in so doing, it can actually be the source of positive emotions for them. And in that case, then that actually does contribute to their quality of life. It's a worthwhile exercise looking at the things in our lives that we think are contributing to our quality of life. And asking ourselves, these things, are they the sources of positive emotions, positive feelings, or are they the sources of negative ones? Because if they are negative ones, then they are a weight. If they're positive ones, well then they are a wing, and they are contributing to your quality of life. And let me tell you, friends, those weights, you either need to get rid of them or at least change what they mean to you. I say it again, the quality of your life is determined by the quality of your emotions. We can't go past that fact. And so that being the case, and a recognition of that fact, has actually started to change the way we think about things even like intelligence. And don't go away, because after the break, we're going to look at an exciting new field which is redefining the way we consider how smart people are. Welcome back. There was a time when we thought that people that could think well were destined to be successful in life, and they were the ones that would go on to experience this wonderful quality of life and all that. And what we soon found, researchers discovered that wasn't in fact the case. In fact, we would go about testing people's intelligence. In the early days, very, very early days, we thought that the size of someone's head might actually be a good indication of their thinking skill, because surely someone with a big head meant that they had more brains in there. Well, we soon discovered that wasn't the case. But we developed tests then. We referred to these as intelligence tests, and we would measure this quotient called the IQ, the intelligence quotient. And people would sit these tests, and we would have our kids sit these tests, and it would come out with a score. And if you had a good score, you'd get a pat on the back, and everyone would say, whoa, you are destined for great things. You're going to be a success in life, and you'll experience great quality of life. And what we've discovered in time is that in fact IQ, your intellectual quotient, contributes less than 20% to your life satisfaction and how successful you are, both in terms of your career, both in terms of your relationships, your financial situation. And so it started to lead researchers to ask the question, well, if intelligence is not what it's all about in terms of thinking skills, what is it that determines how successful people will be and their quality of life? And they set about doing simple tests, and these were fascinating results. One of the most powerful predictors they found of tests in children that indicated as to whether, predicted how well and how successful they would be in their life and even happy at that, to that point, is the simple marshmallow test. Now, what's the marshmallow test? Well, I have a marshmallow here to help me illustrate. Essentially what they would do is these researchers, these psychologists would get kids and they'd take them into a room and they'd place a marshmallow on the table and they would say to this child, now, I'll tell you what, see that marshmallow right there? If you like, you can eat it right now. How does that sound? And the little kids' faces light up. Oh yes, I like that marshmallow. They say, well listen, you're free to go ahead and do just that. However, I've just got to duck out for a moment. If when I get back, that marshmallow's still sitting there, I'll give you 2. How does that sound? And the kid, oh yes. And so then the researchers would exit the room and stand behind one-way glass and observe what happens. And it was quite comical, some of the responses of these kids. Some of the kids would do this, marshmallow, whoo, whoop, and it was gone. It was gone like that. However, other kids had this ability to hold on, to delay, if you like, that gratification. And some of these kids would turn their back to it so they couldn't see it. Others would sit there and close their eyes, but then every now and then they'd just have a quick peek just to make sure that hadn't gone anywhere. They needed that for later. And if they could hold out, when the researcher got back, they would actually give them 2 marshmallows. The fascinating thing, when they did these longitudinal studies where they actually monitored these kids over an extended period of time, they found that the ones that could hold off, the ones that had the ability to delay this gratification, as I said before, actually were often the kids who turned out to be the more socially balanced, the happier, and experience and report higher levels of life satisfaction as time went on. The simple marshmallow test, what's that about? The other test that they actually observed was when they would watch kids in the playground and they would watch how kids reacted when some of their friends were injured or hurt. And there was one instance where one particular kid was watching one of his friends who fell over and grazed his knee, and this kid instantly had tears well up in his eyes as he observed his friend with the scun knee. And then he actually went over and he got some toys and he took him over to his friend, trying to comfort him. And when his friend couldn't be consoled, he then went in search of the teacher to, here, can help, he's hurt himself. And what they were able to show is that kids like this, these kids that have this ability to empathise, to feel for other people, would turn out in later years to be the popular people. They were the ones that others liked. And in fact, that young chap that we mentioned in that instance turned out to be, the school captain. Everyone sort of liked that particular individual. And what it's given rise to is this whole new way of viewing intelligence. And we talk now in terms of emotional intelligence. We say that people with high emotional intelligence often display these 5 attributes. And they include things like, 1, they can recognise their own emotions. They are aware of, I'm feeling a bit down, or I'm feeling happy now. It's forefront in their mind. They have the ability to recognise that. And of course that's important because it's only when you recognise how you're feeling that you can start doing something about it. People with a high emotional intelligence can not only recognise the emotions, but they can also have the ability to manage their emotional state. And really this has been the crux of this series, trying to give you strategies for recognising first of all how you're feeling, and secondly then strategies to change that emotional state. And we spoke about the importance of doing that from the perspective of promoting quality of life. The third skill that people with a high level of emotional intelligence have is the ability to motivate themselves. And there's really 2 facets of this. There's one, the aspect of motivation of doing things that we don't really feel like doing. Like, I don't feel like doing some exercise today, but I'm going to do it anyway. But that's only one aspect of motivation. The other aspect of motivation is refraining from things that we do want to do. And the marshmallow test is a classic example of that. What they find is that people with a high level of emotional intelligence who can motivate themselves can also discipline themselves. And so these are the people that instead of, as soon as they get their first paycheck, race out and grab a big loan so they can have that nice car, they say, if I hold off on that, then I can save up and I can purchase it then. I'm not going to have this huge mortgage or this big loan. And so that's one of the reasons why these individuals often experience greater material gain throughout their and wealth. So they can recognise their emotions, they can manage their emotions, they can motivate themselves. And then in the last two, and these first three really relate to our ability to manage our own emotional state. And the last two relate to an individual's ability, I suppose, to be fluent in the social arts. And this is people that can A, recognise the emotions in others, and B, even manage the emotion in others. And what we've found is that these are the individuals that really do well in life. They do well in their careers. They do well in their relationships. Because these kind of people are the kind of individuals that others warm to, that they get on well, they connect well with. You know, these are the people that can empathise. And in fact, studies have indicated that an inability to empathise, in other words, I suppose we could consider this a poor or a lack of emotional intelligence, is often the root of deviancy. It's often responsible for many social crimes. You know, why do people do things that are going to harm others? Because they don't really care. You know, well, I don't have the ability to feel what they're feeling. And so it can be an avenue to that. In a study of over 1,000 kids, they found it was the kids, though, that have that ability to feel what others feel, that empathy, that were consistently the most popular and the most balanced kids when they grew up and got older. And so this ability to recognise the emotion in others, such an important construct. And even beyond that, there's the ability then to not only recognise the emotion in others, but actually to modify and lift and elevate other individuals. This is where the social genius comes in. You know, just the other day I was visiting a hospital, and I went in there and I watched the nurses, and there was this one particular lady going about her business, and I looked, and you could tell, you know, she had a real empathy for her patients, and the way that she touched. You know, often people that have this high level of emotional intelligence in the social arts have this ability, you know, the hand on the shoulder, you know, the way they listen, they really listen. And it brings you in, and they can able to say words, they're able to do things through their gestures, through a whole manner of strategies they probably don't even know they're employing. They have the ability to lift and elevate other people. You know, these are the social arts. These are people with high level of emotional intelligence. And we have discovered that emotional intelligence is far more predictive of quality of life than is IQ. And so, I come back to that original statement. The quality of your life is determined by the quality of your emotions. But after the break, we're going to learn why it is that it's not just the quality of our life that improves with quality emotions, but also the quantity. Stay tuned. Hi, welcome back. Before the break, I teased you with the idea that not only does the quality of our life improve by the quality of our emotions, but also the quantity of our life. And in fact, there's a new science which is emerging, and it has a very large name. It's psychoneuroimmunology. And essentially what it's about is trying to examine the link between our psychological processes, our thinking processes and our feeling processes, and also our immune function. And the results of some of the studies are intriguing. For example, do you know that in the case where an individual has a spouse pass away, they are twice as likely to die in the month after because of the emotional upheaval associated with that event. We also know that other significant stresses, emotional upheavals in people's lives, suppresses their immune system, such that they are more susceptible to viruses. They're even more susceptible to the incidence and the progression of cancer, believe it or not. And so it's developing this sense that our emotional state does have a very powerful effect on aspects of our quantity of life, I should say. And probably, you know, this should come as no surprise to us. I think we've all been in the instance and had the experience. Well, at least I should say that I haven't had the experience, but a friend of mine told me about the experience where he was driving along in his car, and you know, the speedo reading should have been about here when it was actually about there. And then all of a sudden he heard this woo, woo, woo noise in his coming from somewhere behind. And when he looked in the rear vision mirror, there was a gentleman there with a party hat on, and he had party colourful lights on his roof, and he was instructing my friend to pull over so that he could give him a present. And my friend tells me about some of the changes, just that emotional response, that emotional upheaval, and it's fairly a short-term thing, luckily, and it doesn't happen too often, luckily. But he said that in his body there's things that started to change. You know, his tummy, it's doing flip-flops. His heart, he could feel it almost jumping out of his chest, beating vigorously. And his palms sweat, he can hardly even grip the wiper to wind down the window. You know, and so that's evidence to us all, I think. We all have experienced encounters like this, where our emotional state affects our physiology in a very real way. And so it should come as no surprise that our emotional state can actually affect our health and our quantity of life. The science is still emerging, and we're still trying to get our head around it, but the evidence is there, and the whole area is moving forward. I conducted a very interesting interview just a couple of years ago, and it was with what at the time was a man called Charles Poynton. Get that right? And it was purported that he was the oldest student at Avondale College. And I thought, well, I need to go and chat with Charles, because I'd heard that he was quite an interesting character. And so I went and I caught up with Charles, and he was in the college cafeteria there. And I went over and I said, Charles, I'm assuming you're the one. I'm assuming you're Charles. And he looked up with a big grin, and looked like he had a fairly healthy appetite, lots of fresh food there. And he said, yes, I'm Charles. And so I sat down and I said, Charles, well, just for the record, I need to confirm that you are the oldest student at college. I have some students in some of my classes that are around the late 40s. How old would you be, if you don't mind me asking? And he looked at me and he said, at the moment, I'm 93. And I said, whoa, I think you've taken the title. So let's talk. And we talked, and I asked him about life. I asked him about what's the secret? You know, what's the secret for, you know, obviously you're doing well. He was still, believe it, when he was 89, he walked nearly 50 kilometres as part of a fundraiser. Credible character. And he told me, he said, you know, one of the key ingredients to longevity, a secret to success, is keep a positive attitude and be uplifting. You know, and he spoke in such positive terms. You know, he's a happy character. He was a good person to be around. And he even said to me at one point in time, because he's studying at Avondale College, he said to me, I'm very much looking forward to the next decade. Yeah, and there was an enthusiasm that was contagious. It was just fantastic talking with someone like that. And when I come away from an experience like that, I can't help but believe that not only does our emotional state affect the quality of our life, but it also affects the quantity. You know, my desire for you is to be all that God intends for you to be. And to that end, this whole series is about trying to give you strategies for putting yourself in the best possible emotional state you can be. You know, understanding how our emotional brain is wired up so that we can be up more often. You know, and I don't try and pretend that we can be bouncing off the walls 24/7. You know, it's unrealistic to think that we can be a 10 out of 10 day in, day out. As Solomon said, there is a time for everything. And there are times when we will be feeling flat and low. And it's appropriate that we feel that way in the wake of such life circumstances. But aside from those type of events, I honestly want you to be up more and down less, because that is what God wants for you. In our opening session, our opening episode of this series of Happiness by Design, we developed the idea that there are 3 levels of happiness. There's pleasure, there's meaning, and there's engagement. The deepest of the 3 is meaning. And I believe that through Jesus, you can experience meaning in your life. And it can give birth to a quality of life that's unsurpassed and a quantity of life that goes beyond earthly years. I hope that for you. God bless. I'm Darren Morton, reminding you to delight in God's design.